A growing number of dead pythons were turning up under tree roots, beside streams, and near old burrows. Stranger still, the snakes that survived had stopped breeding in those areas. There were no new clutches. Not a single egg was found in their old nesting grounds. There was no poison, no traps, and no sign of predators. The only clue was the bare ground, stripped of leaves and damp cover. It was as if someone had simply peeled away the top layer of the forest. There was something else that didn't make sense. The ground used to be covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. Now it looked scraped clean. Beneath the roots, the damp pockets where pythons once hid their eggs were gone. Whatever had happened, it had destroyed the very places they needed to survive. The leaves hadn't burned, they hadn't been washed away by water or blown off by the wind, they were disappearing from underneath. Instead of soft leaf litter, the ground beneath the trees was covered in dry, grainy crumbs. That could only mean one thing. Someone was grinding up the forest floor as if it had been fed through a meat grinder. Next, they examined the stomachs of the dead pythons. Many were nearly empty. The frogs, mice, and small lizards that once lived nearby were gone too. The snakes weren't just losing their shelter, they were losing their food. After finding the empty stomachs, they examined the surviving females. They weren't injured and they showed no signs of poisoning, but they were thin. In pythons like these, the body uses whatever energy it has left to stay alive instead of producing eggs. That was why the old nesting sites are empty. The problem traced back to starvation. So they turned their attention back to the prey. Frogs, mice, and lizards hadn't vanished from the entire forest. They disappeared only from the areas where the damp leaf litter was gone. Without it, small animals had nowhere to hide and nowhere to retain moisture. So the pythons didn't just start starving for no reason. First, something had robbed their prey of its own food source. All that remained was to find out what had done it. At first, the ground looked like nothing more than the aftermath of a drought. But drought leaves cracks, dust, and dead leaves scattered across the surface. This was different. The leaves were completely gone, and beneath the trees lay a thin layer of gray debris that looked like used tea leaves. It wasn't soil anymore, not in any normal sense. It was processed matter. Once they lifted the roots and rolled away the old logs, it became clear that the damp pockets underneath them were gone. Underneath them, cool air once lingered. Rotting leaves piled up and the ground stayed soft and loose. Frogs, insects, small lizards, and mice had all retreated into those spaces. Pythons, too, could lie hidden there for hours without drying out or exposing themselves. Now the roots were almost completely exposed. After rain, the water no longer lingered in the leaf litter. It drained away almost immediately. The top layer of ground had become too dry during the day and too exposed at night. Eggs left in a place like that would overheat, lose moisture, and die before they ever had a chance to hatch. And yet, from above, the forest didn't look damaged at all. The trees were still standing, patches of grass remained, the streams hadn't dried up. What had disappeared was the layer underneath, the one most people never even notice. And that meant something hadn't simply passed over the ground, something had been living inside it for a long time, feeding on dead leaves, reducing shelters to crumbs, and slowly stripping the forest of its protective skin. After studying the ground, the researchers shifted their focus to the pythons. And the important clue wasn't the wound, but how the body had changed. At first, a snake looked almost normal, heavy, solid, coiled beneath the roots. A python like that could easily seem like living proof that there was no danger at all. There were no bites, no blood, no signs of a struggle. But then came the first troubling sign. It began leaving its shelter more and more often. Long drag marks trailed across the dry ground. The python no longer lay in ambush for days at a time the way it once had. Instead, it kept moving, checking its old hunting spots, returning to the streams, slipping beneath fallen logs, but there was nothing left to find. From that point on, its body was burning more energy than it could replace. At first, the changes were barely noticeable. Its coils lost their fullness, its sides began to sink in, and its movements grew weaker. Then its body stopped looking round altogether, its back sharpened, its spine became more pronounced, and its skin gathered in small folds. Its head began to look far too large for its emaciated body. And after that, the python no longer behaved like a predator. It moved in short, faltering bursts, stopped more often, struggled to coil itself tightly, and sometimes lay for hours in places where it had once hidden. Its tongue flicked out less frequently. Its reactions slowed and its muscles seemed unable to hold their former shape. This was not a sudden death. It was a slow shutdown of a body that had run out of fuel. Even after the snake died, there was still no sign that anything had attacked it, but its body quickly revealed a different cause. Its eyes clouded over, its mouth could hang slightly open, and its tongue no longer moved. Before long, gases began to swell its belly, even though the snake itself had been reduced to skin and bone. It was a strange sight, a long, exhausted body with a bloated middle. On the dry ground, decomposition happened unevenly. The upper side of the body began to dry out, the scales losing their sheen and becoming stiff. Wherever the python lay closer to damp roots or the edge of a stream, the underside softened much faster. Eventually, the swelling subsided, the tissues caved in, and all that remained of the enormous snake was a long, flattened shape among the roots. And that became an important clue as well. The python had not been killed by a single blow. First, it had been forced to search for food for far too long in an empty forest. Then its body consumed its own reserves until it finally shut down. And only after death did the soil and insects begin to break down what was left. The dead pythons left behind one more problem: their eggs. Even in places where the adult snakes didn't die immediately, almost no new generation was being born. Old nesting sites stood empty, and the few eggs still tucked beneath the roots hadn't been smashed or eaten. They were dying in a different way. Python eggs don't have hard shells like bird eggs. They're soft and leathery, and they need steady moisture to survive. In a healthy nest, a clutch looks firm and alive. The white eggs hold their shape, cling lightly to one another, and remain supple. But once the damp layer of soil disappears, that begins to change. First, the egg loses its sheen. Then, small dents appear in the surface, as though the pressure inside is slowly draining away. This isn't what a predator attack looks like. The egg is simply losing water. The dry, crumbly ground around it doesn't protect the clutch, it draws the moisture out of it. Within days, the dents deepen. The shell turns yellow, wrinkles, and caves inward. The egg is no longer a rounded mass resting on the ground. It flattens, sticks to the soil, and begins to darken in patches. Then comes the heat. Without a blanket of leaves, the ground heats up rapidly during the day and cools just as quickly at night. An adult snake can still crawl away in search of somewhere safer, but a clutch of eggs remains exactly where it was laid. Inside, development slows, then stops altogether. The clutch may still appear intact. Nothing has torn it open, carried it away, or crushed it, but there's already no life left inside. The forest had lost the layer that once acted as a natural incubator, and the eggs began dying right there in their nests. And that's how the pythons disappeared across generations, even the ones that hadn't hatched yet. Okay, but what happened to the python's food? Where did everything go? And why? The first prey to disappear was the kind that was almost invisible to begin with, the tiny creatures no one normally notices. Damp leaf litter was home to springtails, soil mites, beetle larvae, millipedes, slugs, and small spiders. They survived on the thin layer of fungus, decay, and moist organic matter beneath the leaves. Once the leaf litter vanished, so did their food. Fungal threads dried out, beetle larvae had nowhere to develop, slugs lost the damp surface they depended on, and tiny arthropods were left exposed on dry, crumbling ground. That was the first collapse. From above, the forest still looked alive, but at ground level, the bottom layer of the food chain was already disappearing. Next came the animals that fed on those tiny creatures. Small frogs could no longer spend hours hiding beneath roots because their skin dried out much faster than before. Then the effects reached the lizards. They need more than insects, they need cover. On a healthy forest floor, a lizard can vanish in a second, slip beneath a leaf, disappear into a crevice, or freeze in the shadow of a root. On bare, granular soil, even the slightest movement gives it away. So it doesn't necessarily die there. It moves on, searching for places where damp leaf litter still remains. Mice and other small rodents changed their routes as well. They used to travel through sheltered passageways between leaves, roots, and grass. There were seeds, insects, and protection from predators from above. Once that layer disappeared, the open ground became a dangerous road. A mouse could no longer cross the same places where it had once moved almost unseen. And after that, it became clear that the ground wasn't simply drying out, it was being remade from the inside. The first thing to change was the bottom layer of leaf litter. The leaves didn't rot away whole the way they normally would. Their soft tissue disappeared first, leaving behind only delicate veins and a stiff outer rim. It was as if something was stripping the nutrients out of every leaf and leaving an empty skeleton behind. Then those remains began sinking deeper. Down below, they mixed with the mineral soil and came back to the surface in a different form. Tiny, dark granules. That's why this strange grit was appearing under the trees, something that looked less like natural humus and more like processed matter. Next, the layer separating the forest from the soil began to break down. It used to be like a thick, soaked mattress, leaves, fungal threads, roots, and decay all bound together. Now that the mattress was crumbling apart, it was as though it were constantly being dragged through tiny tunnels, ground up, and pushed back out again. With all these underground tunnels, water stopped lingering on the surface. After rain, it didn't collect beneath the leaves, it drained deeper through newly opened channels. The upper layer quickly turned pale, loose, and dry. The damp pockets beneath the roots disappeared as their walls collapsed and crumbled into the same grainy grit. Then the fine roots began to show. They'd once been buried under rich leaf mold. Now they lay almost exposed on the surface. Old burrows widened and the edges of their openings crumbled away. Beneath fallen logs, the sticky damp film along the underside vanished, leaving only a dry trail of dark pellets behind. The ground was being altered constantly, night after night, inch by inch. The forest floor didn't disappear all at once, it was drawn downward, passed through a living system and returned as a dead, dry, loose layer. That was how a place that had once offered shelter, hunting ground, and somewhere to lay eggs was being turned into a bare, parched surface. The big question, of course, was obvious. What could strip away the forest floor so quietly? And eventually, a suspect emerged, a worm. Not the ordinary garden worm we tend to think of as helpful. These were Asian jumping worms. And here's the thing, they can grow up to 6 inches long. And you don't get that big without eating a lot. Scientists had already known that these worms had a voracious appetite and processed organic matter far too quickly. They needed a constant supply of food. And as they fed, they rapidly destroyed the very layer of leaf litter that kept showing up in every clue. But eating everything wasn't the worst part. What they left behind wasn't soft, healthy soil. It was a dry, grainy material that looked like coffee grounds. Exactly the kind of soil that can't hold moisture. In other words, this suspect fit the overall pattern perfectly. It didn't attack the python directly. It didn't even prey on its eggs. It simply changed the habitat. First, the normal leaf litter disappeared, then the soil changed, and from there, everything else followed in a domino effect. But these worms had one more disturbing advantage. They could spread incredibly fast. It turned out they didn't even need a mate. A single worm could produce cocoons on its own, and those cocoons would hatch into new worms, which meant that sometimes all it took to start the whole chain reaction was one tiny cocoon accidentally carried in soil, on gardening equipment, or even on the sole of a boot. For you, it's hiking. For the worms, it's hitchhiking. And that's why the worm became the prime suspect in this story. It didn't look like a snake killer, but it absolutely was one. From that point on, the investigation took a different turn, because if these worms really could reshape an entire forest, then maybe they weren't just a threat. Maybe they could also be used as a tool, and the trail led straight to Florida. Of course it was Florida. If nature was ever going to run some bizarre experiment somewhere, it had to be there. Well, Australia too, I guess. Florida had been dealing with one stubborn problem for years: Burmese pythons. These enormous snakes, native to South and Southeast Asia, somehow found their way into the Everglades and adapted to the place far too well. For them, it was practically a luxury resort. Warm, humid, packed with food, and almost completely free of predators. The pythons began breeding, spreading, and disappearing into the swamp so effectively that, by now, no one even knows how many of them are really out there. Estimates once put the python population in and around the Everglades at anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 snakes. Florida had been fighting them for years. Millions of dollars were spent on removal efforts, and people were specifically hired to track down and kill pythons, but it still wasn't enough. Because a python is almost the worst kind of problem. It hides incredibly well, lives a long time, and can lay dozens of eggs at once. While humans were busy looking for one snake, the swamp kept working against them. You're like, I caught a python. And the swamp is like, great, here are 100 more. Good luck finding them. The damage had been obvious for a long time. In some areas, pythons had nearly wiped out raccoons, opossums, rabbits, and other native mammals. A single invasive species had started reshaping an entire ecosystem around itself. And that's where a genuinely bold idea came in. If it was impossible to get rid of the pythons quickly by targeting them directly, maybe there was another way. attacked the very thing that made Florida such a perfect home for them. Our worms were almost too perfect for the job. They spread fast, altered the soil, stripped away the leaf litter, and triggered a chain reaction from the ground up. What more could you ask for? There was just one tiny problem. Worms are incredibly stupid. You can't tell them, "All right, guys, crawl over there and make life miserable for the snakes." And this is where the whole plan should have fallen apart, because if your main operatives can't follow orders, can't choose a target, and basically live by the logic of dark is good, dry is bad, how are you supposed to control them? You don't, at least not directly, because then they discovered something very interesting. Worms don't need to understand anything in order to behave predictably. They respond to signals, moisture, temperature, soil composition, vibration, and that meant they could be manipulated. The moment people started studying worms more closely, they found out that there were such people as worm charmers. Sounds like someone in the forest has completely lost touch with reality. But the method is very real. They drive a stake or metal rod into the ground, then use it to create vibrations. The earth trembles and the worms crawl to the surface. Why? Because to a worm, shaking ground can mean danger. A mole or some other predator may be digging nearby. There's no time to investigate. It needs to get out. The worm isn't thinking, suspicious, there's a stick shaking in the ground. The worm isn't thinking much of anything, and it still panics. It turned out that worms couldn't be trained, but they could be tricked. All you had to do was create the right conditions, and they would respond exactly the way people wanted them to. Asian jumping worms depended on moisture, temperature, organic matter, and the condition of the soil, which meant they could be nudged in a particular direction. No one had to tell them, crawl over there. It was more like, you'll be more comfortable here. Not breed in this spot, but this spot has everything you need. The idea was no longer just a wild fantasy, it had become a plan. From that point on, the worms' destruction of the soil was no longer accidental. They were steered in a way that would hit the pythons where it hurt. Kind of like a controlled explosion, except with worms. It all sounded brilliantly simple. If a python was hard to find, there was no need to chase down each snake individually. You could just ruin the entire area. No more comfortable living conditions, no more easy hunting, no more breeding. And then another idea came up. What if instead of using the Asian worm exactly as it was, we made it stronger? Not smarter. Honestly, there wasn't much hope on that front. Just enhance the specific abilities it would actually need. Nobody needed a genius worm, they just needed a worm that was damn good at doing worm stuff. At first, that plan seemed pretty convincing. After all, a python didn't need a personal enemy. Nothing had to attack it with teeth, claws, and dramatic background music. It was enough to make the world around it worse. The worm versus the place where the snake lived. Yeah, the epic factor dropped a little, but results are what matter. This upgraded worm was supposed to devour dead leaves and plant debris faster. Then the soft, damp layer of forest litter would disappear more quickly. It would also churn through the topsoil more aggressively, turning the hiding places beneath roots and fallen logs into dry, crumbly dirt. And ideally, it would reproduce even faster, speeding up the whole process. But none of these were really superpowers. They were just enhanced versions of abilities the worm already had. Biologically speaking, there was nothing especially complicated about that. Scientists had done similar things plenty of times with insects. Flies, for example, or mosquitoes. And that was when the temptation appeared to go one step further and turn the worm into an actual hunter. Why not? Give it teeth, venom, the stare of a serial killer, and pretty soon the pythons will be the ones living in fear. But that idea fell apart almost immediately. An earthworm isn't the first step on the road to becoming a snake killer. It's not even heading in the same direction. It has no teeth, no venom, not even jaws, and it certainly wasn't built to digest prey. Evolution didn't create worms to hunt. It created them for an entirely different job. Eating dead organic matter and processing soil through their bodies, which meant that turning one into a snake killer wouldn't involve tweaking a feature or two. You'd have to rebuild the entire creature from the ground up. Would it even still be a worm at that point? Probably not. Even in nature, the more predatory worm-like creatures tend to operate on a much smaller scale. They may catch tiny prey, but they don't turn into hunters of large snakes, so there was no ready-made natural blueprint for a python-killing worm that scientists could simply copy. The conclusion was a little disappointing. Creating a super worm was impossible, but unleashing a saboteur worm was entirely doable. It wouldn't have to come face to face with a snake or ambush one from around a corner. It wouldn't even have to win a direct fight. Its mission was simple, and always had been: make the python's lives a living hell. Maniacal laughter while doing it is optional, but encouraged. And yet, the very fact that the idea seemed so simple and tempting was what made it dangerous. This worm wouldn't need to look terrifying. It would just eat leaves, churn through soil, and do what worms have always done, only faster and with consequences no one could predict. That gave our story one deeply unpleasant twist. The very trait that made worms seem useful in the first place also made them dangerous to everything else in the forest. They'd been chosen because they could transform the soil quickly, devouring the leaf litter, drying out the upper layer of earth, destroying the snake's hiding places, and generally making reptile life miserable. Turns out the rest of the forest doesn't exactly enjoy that either. Who could have guessed? Worms can't, and never could, be programmed to go after pythons. They have no idea whether they're crawling past a rare plant or just some random branch with leaves on it, and obviously worms don't understand how to choose a target. They would simply do what nature built them to do: eat, reproduce, alter the soil, and keep spreading. Which means that if this plant ever moved from paper into the real world, the consequences would ripple through the entire ecosystem. And in some parts of the United States, earthworms have already been causing serious problems for a long time. In the Northeast, for example, nearly all earthworms are non-native, and European and Asian species have been altering the structure of forest soils for years. Asian jumping worms are a newer threat, but they're spreading fast as well. They've already been found in the Southeast, along the East Coast, across the Midwest, and even in parts of the Pacific Northwest. It all started back in the early 20th century when worms like these first arrived in the United States and potted plants. And then it was the usual story: soil, mulch, plants, machinery, shoes. And just like that, the worm was traveling more than most people do. That was when the full scale of the risk became impossible to ignore. If these worms were already capable of spreading on their own, then deliberately releasing them into the wild wouldn't just mean adding another tool, it would mean opening the door for a species that could escape the experiment zone and start reshaping environments where no one ever wanted it. And the damage wouldn't stop at the soil. Once worm populations become dense enough, they can disrupt everything that depends on that ground layer, from plant roots and fungi to small animals and even birds. On top of that, these worms can help invasive plants take over because the old forest leaf litter disappears and the entire habitat begins to change. So our brilliant plan had suddenly started to sound like, why don't we solve one invasive species disaster by creating another one? Ideally, a program like this would have to be highly targeted, not dump a bunch of worms into the forest and let them figure it out, but a small, controlled test site where researchers know in advance how far the worms could spread, how they would be tracked, and what to do if they crossed the boundary. Better still, it would involve a controlled strain, a specially selected or engineered subspecies designed to do the job under a very specific set of conditions, and stop doing it outside those conditions. A worm that could disrupt python hiding places without turning into a brand new problem for the entire forest. But that would be a tall order for any geneticist. And even then, it wouldn't solve the biggest problem with the whole idea. Florida isn't home to invasive pythons alone. It also has native snakes that have done absolutely nothing wrong. They haven't invaded anything or thrown the ecosystem out of balance. In fact, many of them are already suffering because of invasive species. But they live in much the same way. They hide in shelters, depend on moisture, and occupy the same lower layers of the habitat. And worms don't care whose lives they make miserable. A worm doesn't know who's right or wrong. It doesn't know anything. It's a worm. And so our story for today ended before it even began. On paper, the idea sounded perfect. Take a tiny creature that destroys its environment and turn that destructive power against a much larger invasive predator. There you go, brilliant work. Here's a Nobel Prize in worm science. Except that a worm is hardly a precision weapon. It hits everything in its path, whether it's an invader, a native species, or even a tree. And at that point, the real question is no longer whether the idea could work against the pythons, it's whether there would be much of the forest left once it was over. Sure, the Burmese pythons might disappear, but the collateral damage could have been enormous. So maybe let's not make the whole worm situation any worse. You owe me a like. See you later.